Welcome everyone to the inaugural virtual online session held by the Chartered Governance Institute of British Columbia and Kingsdale Advisors. Since this is the first session held via Zoom, there may be some disruptions, but we hope to keep them to a minimum. To assist us in doing so, kindly keep your microphone on mute unless you have a question for the speaker. In order to experience less broadband issues, you may also want to turn your video off while you listen. This still allows you the ability to see the speaker and his presentation. I will ask Mr. Ian Robertson to pause occasionally to allow for questions, and questions that are not relevant to the topic at that time, please hold until the end of the session, at which time they can be addressed more fully. Mr. Ian Robertson has kindly made himself available to present to us today on navigating governance during COVID-19. You have all read the brief bio we provided in the invitation, and Ian will properly introduce himself when he begins the presentation. But I would like to start by saying that I have been involved with Kingsdale for almost 15 years. While Kingsdale has many different areas of expertise, providing relevant and up-to-date guidance on governance and shareholder engagement has attributed to my personal growth as a Chartered Secretary during that time. I very much appreciate that. Welcome, Ian, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me today. You guys are lucky because our CEO, Amy Friedman, is also joining us to listen in and get to know you guys. So if there's any questions I can't answer or she doesn't like something I said, she may chime in and contribute to our discussion as well. First of all, if you don't know Kingsdale, let me give you a little bit of an overview about who we are and what we do. So Kingsdale was founded, Jody, you've been working with us for 15 years. So we were founded in 2003. So a few years before we started working with you. And we're known as Canada's #1 shareholder advisory firm. And we have advised on all of the largest and most high profile proxy fights, contested and friendly M&A. But we also do a lot of regular annual general meetings. And I know a lot of people here will say, well, you know, every time I think I'm going to have a regular AGM, there's always something new that comes up. So the bulk of our work is helping companies navigate through their AGM. One of the things that makes our company different than other shareholder advisory firms or proxy solicitors you may know is that we have a very unique governance advisory service that allows a lot of you in this room who have probably had questions related to governance, compensation, you know, looking at board matrix, these sorts of things that our team advises on. And we have a full complement of other services as well. We offer strategic communication services, proxy solicitation around meetings, information agent, depository agent, and other services associated with basically any transaction or any event that requires a shareholder vote and communication. So I'll get into my presentation now and walk through some thoughts on what is the ever-evolving pandemic of COVID-19 and some things you should be thinking about. In putting this presentation together, I reflected on what are the most common questions that we've advised companies on through this pandemic and this proxy season. And then also look forward a little bit to try and predict what are the things that we think might be coming up that we should be at least thinking about as directors on Canadian boards. So here's the overview. The pandemic does not change the way directors should approach their roles and responsibilities, but it does heighten the scrutiny and accountability that directors will find themselves under. It also provides an opportunity for them to lead by example. One of the things that directors and you as those who provide supports to directors have probably realized is the amount of attention that's been required over the last, you know, call it since the end of February, has been significant. Increased involvement, increased concentration on events surrounding the business, on impacts on the long-term strategy. But there's also been, what I've heard from a lot of directors, is there's been a learning curve that they've had to force themselves through that they had never thought about before as it relates to science and medicine to try and predict where's this going to go next. What does it mean for our constituents, our other stakeholders? One of the things a lot of companies have been contemplating, at least at the beginning of this process, was should we set up a special committee that's going to deal with COVID-19? And there's differing views on this, and it obviously is company specific. But what I had said to a number of people was, Probably best not to segment out certain people who are becoming experts on this subject, because where this thing looks like it's going in the trajectory is going to touch every single part of your business, every single part of your operation, and it's going to last for a long time. So now we're hearing predictions that it'll go on possibly 2 years. So it's better if the whole board has a full picture on the company's COVID response and an understanding of the types of issues and dynamics that are at play, as a lot of those, as we've learned, have changed on a daily, if not hourly basis. Of note, one of the things that we've been advising directors as well is to ensure that management in the company are not only dealing with the immediate day-to-day issues, but they're also thinking ahead and prepared for other possible scenarios that might emerge. The challenge when you go into any crisis scenario is not only balancing out the need to deal with the short-term implications to get yourself through the crisis, but thinking about how do we optimally position our company for success when the crisis subsides. In this case, you've moved from a crisis that initially looked like it might be a couple of weeks or months to now what is going to be a new normal that's going to fundamentally reshape the way a lot of businesses do business, and also fundamentally shift the way a lot of companies think about their governance structures as well. So reflecting on this proxy season and what we advise companies on, here are the top 5 things that we've discussed, and I'll walk you through all of them. So the first one is virtual annual general meetings, shareholder engagement in an age when you can't actually get out and talk to people, compensation implications, defensive preparedness for companies that have been left vulnerable through this process, and the emergence of the S in ESG, which is the social aspect. So here's some advice we offered during the pandemic as it related to shareholders and investor interest and market disclosures. So the advice we gave at the beginning of the pandemic was that communications to your shareholders and all stakeholders for that matter need to be clear, concise, and consistent. Shareholders will understand when you're in a crisis that you may not have all of the answers, but they do want to see a demonstration that you are thinking about and on top of a changing dynamic. So to things like, what's the approach to capital allocation? Are we prepared to deal with supply chain disruption? How are we thinking about the market downturn, both in terms of negative implications for the company, but also strategic opportunities that may present itself? Some companies, and I would say this is more common in the US, given their heavy retail industry and others, some companies have withdrawn guidance, and they did so early in this process. But that's not enough to say, shrug your shoulders and say, well, who knows what's going to happen? Shareholders do need more communicated to them in terms of how you're thinking about the challenge of pandemic. And the other thing that directors need to be thinking about is, well, how are we going to handle new and emerging issues outside of our quarterly disclosures and MIC? A number of companies have started issuing press releases on COVID-19 specifically. That was done earlier in the process, but other companies have done updates as there's been significant implications. So again, retail, heavily focused industries, the airlines, ones that have more implications on a more regular basis have been doing disclosures outside of your normal quarterly disclosures to keep their shareholders up to date. The other thing that we discussed a lot in conjunction with the lawyers and the legal teams is, how do you balance disclosure obligations with investor expectations and common sense? So what we've advised our clients is generally to err on the side of over communicating to make sure that shareholders understand that you're on top of the issue. And even if the impacts to your business are going to be minimal, because there is such a bright spotlight on this issue, particularly in the earlier days, let's make sure that you're out and talking about those things. Even if there's not a legal obligation to disclose or discuss something publicly, you need to understand that your shareholders are in a vacuum, probably experiencing a lot of anxiety given where we've seen the markets over the last couple of months, and looking for answers from the leadership of their companies. One of the observations we've made is that Canadian companies tend to be more thoughtful and measured in their disclosures. And what we attribute this to is the perception that Canada, at least at the outset, appeared to be more prepared than other nations to manage the outbreak. So the onus on companies to say, what are they doing to manage and almost act as a local healthcare authority or something like that was less for Canadian-based companies than you might see in other jurisdictions. And generally, we outline what companies should should include there. Obviously, foreseeable financial impact on operations, concerns with supply chains, and any agreements that could be impacted by the pandemic. Moving from the pandemic to post-pandemic, the aftermath and how the company operates coming out of this will increase the focus on corporate government, the role of management, and an engaged board. What shareholders are looking for is maximum attention by their leaders on the company. And they're going to be measuring not only the response during the pandemic, but how quickly can a company right itself after it goes through a process like this. And what we're talking to a lot of companies about is how do you swiftly prepare for a gradual transition to the new normal so that the company's optimally positioned to capitalize and move quickly on opportunities and any challenges that might emerge. So the things directors should be thinking about is not only the obvious, which is how do you restart or expand our operations in this new normal, but how do you protect the safety of employees and customers? And on that point, this is the pandemic's come at an interesting time because there's been a lot of conversation about, who is the paramount stakeholder for companies? Is it shareholders? Is it all stakeholders? Where do employees fit into this? Where do the communities we operate? How does this all come together? So if there was any doubt before, I would say coming out of this pandemic, it's expected that directors take a broader view of who their constituents are, who their key stakeholders are, and make decisions with more than just the shareholders in mind. Obviously, how are you going to implement new federal, provincial, and local orders? So, particularly if you're a TSX or TSXV listed company, but you do operations in Africa or some other jurisdiction, it will be interesting to see what they put in place as protections or don't put in place as protections, and then how your company should address those or go above and beyond what's been put in place locally. Manage expectations as supply lines and infrastructure are rebuilt. Reintegrating remote working or furloughed employees. I know this is a big consideration for everybody. The comment I've heard from a lot of people is, it was a little choppy at the beginning of this work from home experiment, but we kind of like it. And, for some percentage, we're going to stick with it for the long term. And then how do you facilitate employee and customer trust following terminations and cancellations? So, the airlines, a lot of retail, how do you go about rebuilding the relationships that you've spent decades building, given that your normal business model has now been completely uncut? Some additional short-term considerations, and I did these in the forms of questions that I can make this presentation available afterwards, but you may want to note down to discuss not only with management, but with the board of directors as well. First one is, are we confident based on the information we're getting that the company's response is both effective and sustainable? And it's really the last part of that on the sustainable issue that's the question. A lot of management teams and their employees have been put through a marathon, but it's been run at a sprint pace for the last 100 days or so. So, really thinking, management's on top of things now, but is the way we are operating, which is crisis mode in most circumstances, is that going to be sustainable long-term? And evaluating if it's not, what do we need to do about it? Are there opportunities to fulfill an unmet need as a result of COVID-19? So some businesses have identified additional strategic opportunities that have been presented through this process. So, we're all on Zoom right now. Zoom is probably the biggest beneficiary of COVID-19. Are there opportunities for growth through distressed M&A? I know a lot of BC-based companies, small TSXV companies are challenged. But you may also be looking for opportunities if your balance sheet is in decent shape or your stock is in good shape, or I guess vis-a-vis your peers, to look at some opportunities there. Do we now have a better line of sight on COVID-19's impacts on the business fundamentals? and how do we hold management accountable for the performance over both the long and short term. So the game has changed, right? The business you are in for a lot of companies has changed considerably. The targets that were set are now way off or obsolete. And the compensation, which I'll talk about in a minute, probably needs to be realigned to reflect not only the experience of shareholders, but to match what the new trajectory and objectives of the company is going to be. Does our crisis communications plan and response need refining before wave 2 or even wave 3? So a lot of people have learned a lot as they've gone through the crisis, not only from a PR perspective, but also a response plan all the way down from the board and management. Why there is a little bit of lull as we start moving into the new normal. I think the wide consensus is there will be another wave at some point, if not 2 waves. When that comes again, what do you learn from this process that we need to get into place early to make sure we're adequately or optimally positioned to deal with that? The last one is the risk of permanent or temporary loss of management is elevated. So a board needs to be thinking about, are there adequate succession plans in place if directors or management get infected? And there's 2 levels for this, right? We need to be thinking not only in terms of who's the immediate successor, but is there a replacement for the immediate successor? Obviously Canada's situation and BC's is very different from the rest of Canada as well. But if you look in the US where it's spreading exponentially, what do you do if you lose a critical member of your team and they're in the hospital in lockdown for 2 months? What happens? If there's a fatality, what do you do? And it's not only thinking about who's the next man up, but who's the next man or woman up after that man or woman. Longer term, here are a couple questions to think about. So what are the lasting effects on the market and consumer behavior? And then what changes do we need to adjust proactively to prepare for these changes? What are the impacts on the long-term strategy and what should we be adjusting now or thinking about? How have stakeholder expectations regarding the responsibilities of the board and executive management team changed? How will the concepts of accountability and due diligence change? So the board's obviously in a very different situation. There's limited, if you're looking at a transaction, obviously doing diligence, doing mine site visits and such in a situation where you can't actually get to the mine, you can't meet with your counterparty in person, creates a number of interesting challenges. And the last one is to engage in a lessons learned exercise once the dust settles. What do we do well? What can we learn? What can we do better next time? Moving on now to the virtual AGMs, and I'll walk through now the 5 highlights that we've seen this proxy season, and I'll pause after each one if there's any questions. So this year, virtual AGM saw a ramp up dramatically. Basically before this year, you'd sort of seen between none to 4 virtual AGMs or hybrid AGMs in Canada. And the question really now as we think about this is, are they here to stay? So for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, a virtual AGM would be a digital only on your computer like we're doing now through one of the service providers, Lumi or Broadridge, and you conduct your AGM in its entirety in that form. A hybrid AGM would be the digital plus the option of an in-person meeting as well. And then the last one would be your traditional in-person AGM. So for the proxy season this year, we saw approximately 90% of Kingsdale's clients made the switch to a virtual format meeting. There were a few companies who were forced to proceed with in-person meetings, and that was really due to a lack of availability from the service providers, because you saw a massive ramp up in days when people would want to have AGMs. They would be back to back to back, and the providers just wouldn't have the capacity. We know from our conversations with Broadridge and Lumi that as you look through the rest of the year, that's not as big of a concern. As well as there were some companies that had specific bylaws that restricted their ability to do a virtual only meeting. This year, the TSX and the TSXV announced relief measures that allowed issuers basically to postpone their annual meeting until December 31st. So we saw a number of issuers who made use of that. The clients we're working with right now who made that decision to delay their annual meeting, it's interesting because we still don't have clarity on what are the public health rules going to be. Can you still do an in-person AGM? Are you able to do a hybrid? What are the rules going to be for number of people who could attend if you do a hybrid or in-person meeting? So many variables. So we continue to advise companies to stick with the virtual AGM. Not only is it, as I'll talk about in a second, it's easier for people to attend because directors can't travel, but it also tends to be more cost effective than a traditional AGM where you have to buy bagels and stuff. Contested meetings in Canada have also been pushed, and that's due to various in-person requirements. The reality is providers cannot accommodate competing ballots. There's some issues with regards to certain parties involved in the process willing to take on risks associated with accurate tabulation and such. So right now they can do virtual AGMs in the US, but in Canada presently that's not an option that's available. So if you're thinking about a virtual AGM for this year, if you haven't done it already, there's a couple things to be thinking about. So the first one is it permissible under your company's bylaws as well as all the corporate statutes that you have to follow? So under most Canadian corporate statutes, the board can adopt amendments to the bylaw that would be effective until the meeting concludes, that would allow them to hold a virtual AGM. We saw most companies that didn't currently have it written in would make those changes. There was never any regulatory issues. There seems to be a broad consensus, both from the proxy advisors and from the regulators, that everyone needs to move in this direction. It's the right thing to do. So if there are any little sticking points around, for example, allowing shareholders to answer questions, things like that, that they tended to turn a blind eye just to get the meeting process through. If your meeting is going to be contentious in any way, if there's a possibility of a proxy fight, then companies really need to think about what are the benefits of having and drawbacks of having a meeting that has greater control, which is a virtual meeting. You have a lot more control over it. And companies need to really say, okay, based on the items that are on our agenda and the proxy card, are they going to draw additional scrutiny from shareholders? Are we likely to see a significant against withhold campaign? Are we going to see shareholder proposals? If you think those things are on the radar, those are additional considerations that would come into play before you landed on doing a full-blown virtual AGM. One of the risks that need to be balanced is between allowing individuals to be disruptive at an in-person meeting versus a virtual AGM, where the idea previous to this year was that virtual AGMs tend to be less transparent, allow you to shut down stakeholders. And in the past, there had been some backlash around that. This year, not so much. Everyone understands the process. We work with companies to make sure that there's not only an opportunity during the meeting, but more importantly, before the meeting, to get questions out to the company. And again, a lot of the questions that shareholders ask are not on the formal part of an AGM. It's usually on the management's presentation, which usually comes after. I'm just checking out the rest of what I wrote here. Yeah, basically it comes down to making sure that shareholders are able to have the same rights that they would have in person in terms of asking questions, engaging the board and management, and not screening out, filtering, or blacklisting others who might try and participate in the meeting. The one thing to note is that when you do have a virtual AGM, there is some reduced certainty because of the introduction of real-time voting. So more shareholders may choose to submit votes live versus doing it via an advanced proxy. The ones we've looked at, and I would say those who vote in real time have not been enough to statistically impact the outcome of the vote, but it's just something to be aware. Again, particularly if there's any controversial items on the ballot. And then the last thing is the cost of a virtual meeting, as I said, are significantly lower. Again, if you have issues right now with directors traveling, particularly your chair and other key members, getting them into Canada, especially if they're from another country, is a challenge. It just goes to show that a virtual meeting is probably a better option. Are there any questions on that?
Thank you, Ian. Wow, that's a lot of information. And I must admit that the one thing you brought to my attention that I hadn't really given a lot of thought of during this time is the succession planning. That's really a very good point there. One other thing I was wondering about, though, is the costs. I had understood that it was actually expensive to use those two services that you had mentioned for virtual meetings. And because I haven't actually had to organize one yet, I'm not aware of the costs involved. Is it truly like less expensive to do so?
Well, it depends how cheap your annual meeting normally is, I guess.
I
Right?
guess so. It'll be interesting to check into that soon.
Yeah, if you only have 5 people and no bagels and you do it at your law firm, then it's pretty cheap. But if you're, if the cost of renting a room in BC, because I was looking at it for one of our events, was, between 6,000 to 10,000 bucks, right? And that's before the bagels. So.
Yes, yes. Well, and actually, I won't drag on to this, but one of my clients has opted to postpone. Whether that means we'll be able to do it in person or have to do it virtually or a hybrid, I'm not too sure yet. But we generally expect less than 50 people, and if they continue allowing 50 people, we might be able to squeak by with the traditional. So I guess we can leave it open for any other questions or comments and then move on.
Good stuff. Okay, I'll try and move a little bit quicker because I'm just aware of the time. So shareholder engagement, I'll preface this by saying the new normal in Canada is that independent directors meet with their shareholders. This is something that used to be taboo, but it really has become the new normal, where not just management, but directors are now engaged with different shareholders and participating. As it relates to COVID-19, obviously the press valuations are going to create different pressures from different shareholder groups who will be obviously experiencing the pandemic and the market in different ways, but it'll also have different viewpoints on how the company can rate itself again after the crisis. Being locked in your house with your family is not an excuse for issuers to go dark. It's not a license to put a pause on your activities. The expectations of your investors during this process have not changed at all. And I would say, given the crisis overhang, it's in fact heightened. What we're encouraging people to do is figure out who your shareholders are in light of the market sell-off. So conduct an in-depth shareholder analysis, initiate a stock surveillance program, keep an eye on company announcements, 13F, sector flows, these sorts of things so you know who's in your stock. Also look at it as an opportunity to, a lot of companies keep an evergreen list of potential investors who like the story but cited valuation as the reason is they're not buying. Consider reaching out to them and asking, will they buy now? Utilize video conferencing with top holders. I would say that early in the pandemic, I think people right now are going through a little bit of Zoom meeting fatigue, notwithstanding the great turnout we have here. And we saw a lot of investors who were saying, you know what, let's do it via Zoom. We get more of our team on. So we saw early in this process, a lot of investors, particularly heading into AGM season, who were appreciative of the opportunity to engage with directors via obviously a web service provider like this, or we also saw some investors host almost event sites and event portals on their websites as well. We also tell people as they go through this process, don't forget retail, right? So if you're a TSXV company, probably got a lot of retail, gold bugs, these sorts of people. So make sure that you're always considering them and engaging them as part of this process as well. How do you do that? Well, don't let your website become stale. Make sure that you have a clearly marked section of your website that articulates how you're dealing with COVID-19. We recommend including a short video from the CEO highlighting the steps that they've taken, basically to say, I'm in control of the situation. Here are the things I'm thinking about. We also recommend continuously putting up an updated FAQ, which will populate with the most frequently asked questions that have been coming up. Also consider using social and traditional media to get your message out. So if you have an FAQ that keeps coming up, tweet it out, make sure people are aware of it. Consider a proactive media relations strategy. Now, a lot of people have asked about, like, what about roadshows? What do we do, right? We had this plan in the fall. What are we going to do? Well, we always say take your cue from your shareholders. Don't be afraid to check in on their preference. Some of them will still want to have something virtually. Others may say, no, we prefer to do it one-on-one. So really take a cue from the people you want to meet and figure out a way to do it. The benefit about doing a virtual roadshow is obviously you're able to cover more ground, and you may get a different audience than you would if you were doing an in-person meeting. And another effective tactic that we've seen that we like is virtual fireside chats, where you would have a CEO in a format like this and open it up to a larger retail audience to come and ask questions. I'd say the space we've seen that the most is probably in the cannabis space, who tend to be a little bit more young, hip, and forward thinking than other companies, and not afraid to get up there and mix it up with their shareholders. So compensation, another big topic that's come up this proxy season, and it really has become a balancing act because companies are forced to lay off workers, but they also need to balance that with how do we retain talent for the future to make sure that the company is successful. So compensation committees throughout this process, we've been working with them to really consider and understand the implications of COVID-19 and to make sure that there's appropriate compensation arrangements in place to address employee cash needs, while also maintaining essential personnel and maintaining sufficient working capital. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to, how do we address our compensation issues in COVID-19. These are just some of the approaches that companies should be thinking about. What we have seen as well is that many companies have had to go back to the drawing board and reassess their appropriateness of the performance goals that they set for 2020. And they really need to ensure that they have sufficient or provide sufficient line of sight to management. So what these adjustments could be when they go back and reassess the appropriateness, it could be a combination of target adjustments, change in metrics, change in measurement period, delaying the timing of set objectives until there's more clarity. But really it all comes down to evaluating your situation on a case-by-case basis. Now, in attempting to strike the right balance, companies have announced voluntary pay cuts, either by their executive management team and directors or more broadly across the organization. But the question that comes out of this is how long should the pay cuts stay in effect? Because there's many shareholders who may be of the view, okay, well, when you go to phase 1 or phase 2, that doesn't mean your pay cut should end at that point. How long should your pay cut last is an interesting question. In the US, we've seen companies offer executive teams retention bonuses to offset their COVID-19 pay cuts. So I cite an example here of Chesapeake Energy, which would trim, so they were going to trim executives' target bonuses, but at the same time, they were going to prepay $25 million in new target bonuses for 21 executives, which essentially served as a retention bonus for them. So for companies that are cutting pay but still handing out equity, given the pandemic's now expected length, what is this going to look like over the next 2 years, and what does that mean for your company and for your management team? Of note this year, when you look at ISS and Glass Lewis, the proxy advisors, and Say on Pay, we've seen a significant decrease in the number of negative recommendations from both ISS and Glass Lewis when it comes to Say on Pay. Part of this is attributable, as I said at the beginning, to the fact a number of meetings have been moved later in the year. But it also indicates that the proxy advisors have taken a more lenient approach than they have in other years when it comes to Say on Pay. And at the same time, shareholders have also seemed to show a greater support for management with an uptick in average support levels for Say on Pay. And this year, so far, only 8 issuers received less than 80% support versus 22 in 2019, and no Say on Pay votes have failed this year. And the reason why that 80% or 70%, depending on which proxy advisor you look at, is they set those thresholds. So if you fall below that, you're required in the following year to go out and engage your shareholder base to understand their concerns as it relates to your compensation practices. I'll summarize the rest of this by basically saying what companies are being encouraged to do is incorporate more discretion into their program. That leaves more room for compensation committees to make adjustments away from the formula, given the uncertainty that's likely to last over the next 2 years. And as I'll touch on at the end, companies are also being encouraged to consider how ESG metrics can become a more integral part of that format, and how executives can be held accountable on ESG related measures given the spotlight that's been placed on those during the pandemic. So maybe we'll pause there. I ran through 2 of them, so if there's any questions there.
Hi, Ian. I see that Angel, I'm not sure how to say her name, has written a note to you in the Zoom group chat asking how corporations can be prepared for uncertain situations in the future. Will you be addressing that maybe towards the end?
I think so. We'll talk a little bit about that, but if I don't answer it, then we can come back to that one.
Perfect. Thank you.
So fourth thing I want to talk about today is defensive preparedness. The reality is that the market volatility has impacted the shareholder activism landscape, and that many public companies are now attractive targets for activist investors. So if you're saying, well, how do you know that? If we look at history as a guide, following the 2008 financial crisis, we saw a significant increase in the number of hostile bids, proxy fights, activism, and event-driven investing. So if you look at that as a similar, an analogous situation to this one, we're predicting it is probably pretty likely that we're going to see more activists coming out of the woodworks. And then the important thing to note in Canada is activists are not, your Bill Ackmans, your JANA partners. A lot of them are, former founders, CEOs, longtime shareholders that you've had in your company, institutional investors who are not happy with the way things are going and adopt activist tactics to get the result that they want. So it's not a matter of looking down your list and saying, oh, I don't see Bill Ackman on my list, therefore I'm safe. It's really about understanding the kinds of questions that you're getting from shareholders, understanding where they're pushing from, how significant is that push, and understanding where they might take that. Some companies look at themselves and they say, we're doing okay. We feel like we're getting back on track. And what we always say is peer comparisons matter. So don't just look at where your share price is versus where it was. Understand how you're stacking up against your competitors, and who the appropriate comparator groups and peer groups might be for you when you're doing those evaluations. What should we do? So how do we get prepared today? There's 4 main things we encourage companies to do. So the first one is to conduct an in-depth shareholder analysis in light of the market sell-off, which we talked about. Keep engaged and up to date with your shareholders, always keeping a pulse on your shareholders, and understanding, as I said, the questions and concerns that are coming up is a good canary in the coal mine to understand if there's an activist or an activist thesis being forwarded. Review your governance and bylaw best practices. So make sure that you're thinking ahead when it comes to your board and how an activist might attack it. What is our tenure of our directors? Do our directors have skin in the game? These sorts of questions. Do I have an advance notice policy? All of these sorts of defensive questions. And then actually put in place a defensive preparedness strategy. So, working with a firm like Kingsdale, your legal advisors, financial advisors, if you have them, how can we get prepared today? If I was an activist and I was going to attack my company, what are the questions I would be asking? How would I, rip apart? How would I look at, spin-offs, asset sales, change in leadership, other things that we could be doing vis-a-vis our peer companies? Understanding what those are and then planning that if these things become issues, how am I going to address them? And we work with companies to put in place what we call a defensive playbook, but also, your PR strategy associated with rebuffing that. And we also help advise companies on what do we need to do now to make sure that the threat of an activist never becomes a reality. How do we take that off the table early? And the last thing I would say is that, if there's a company, if you represent a company that's contemplating a transaction, given the turnover, you're really going to know where your shareholders stand. and lockups and outreach will be more critical to success, I would say, in the new normal following the pandemic. A final word before I take questions from everybody is the S in ESG. So pre-COVID-19, when you thought about ESG, environmental issues were seen as a predominant concern amongst companies and institutional investors, after governance, of course. What is dramatically ramped up, first starting with COVID-19 and then accelerated with the murder of George Floyd, is that investors now see social issues, including the management of a company's own, health and safety of employers, relationships with suppliers and customers, as being of primary importance. And the way I characterize it is George Floyd and COVID-19 simultaneously forced society, companies to confront deep-rooted social issues and forced everybody in Canada, in the US, in the world to answer these questions. So, the pandemic raised a general global question about how are seniors treated? How does the neglect of the poor and the marginalized impact things? What is the effect of racism? How does a weak and underfunded healthcare system impact us? Weak education system? These are big philosophical questions that have been raised that says, what is the role and the responsibility of the company and the board of directors in addressing these? What is our role as a company in society? One of the initiatives that I'll highlight, because it was founded by our CEO and founder, our chairman and founder, Wes Hall, is the Black North Initiative, which aims to commit companies via a CEO pledge to increase Black representation in the C-suite and boardroom, which is modeled after the 30% pledge that added gender diversity to Canadian boardrooms. And one of the predictions that we're making, and I'll close on this note, is that companies that don't move to address anti-Black systemic racism and the race issue and take, I would say, social issues in general more seriously will be targeted by activists, I would say less so, but more so by institutional investors, in the same way that it took a decade for not only corporate Canada, but investors to tune into the diversity initiative and really not only solve it, but apply pressure to corporate Canada to get ahead of this issue. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have. I'm trying to figure out how to read the chat.
I think Angeline's question was answered, but if not, she could speak up and more, maybe ask a more specific question there.
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I think you covered most of the part of my question. I would like to specifically know how the corporations can make a provision financially so that they don't have to lay off the employees in future if there is any such situation, or if there is a second wave as we are predicting.
So, sorry, my computer, what was the first part of the question? How can companies set aside money?
Yes, yes.
Well, it's really a question that they'll have to answer for themselves based on, what their strategic objectives are, understanding where their workforce is. I can't really advise on what the best way is for a company. Every company is different, looking at their balance sheet and what they need to do. I would say as a principle, companies need to understand and should be thinking about, if we need to lay employees off right now, are we making use of the grants and benefits that are available for the government? Does that allow us to retain key people longer? What is the trade-off? But it all comes back to understanding where does the company want to be in a year, 2 years down the road, and who's critical to that process, and then making decisions to make sure the right people are still in the corporate family, as it were, even if they're furloughed and able to come back to the company.
Thank you so much. That was a really informative session. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ian, I have to say I agree with you on that. I think it's going to be interesting to see how many people actually go back working into office environments at the end of all of this, and whether or not more people than just, say, the C-suite, which has been primarily in the past, who could work from home, will be doing so, you know, from the top to the bottom, since we've all proven that it's quite capable.
Yeah.
So that's great. Is there anyone else that has any questions for Ian?
Hi, I do. Thank you for a really, really good presentation. I currently serve on a not-for-profit board and one that deals with the public. So some of the considerations for not-for-profits would be quite different than they would be for corporates. Would you care to expand a little bit on what some of the not-for-profit boards should be considering in these times?
Well, first one would be safety and health of your employees and other core constituents, right? And it's not just saying, okay, well, here's what public health has said in our jurisdiction that we need to do, but, you know, taking a read on your constituents and stakeholders to say, okay, is that public health standards seen as the minimum, or is that seen as the ceiling for what should we be doing? Do we need to be doing additional things on top of that? And what I've noticed is that every company, every not-for-profit has different viewpoints from their constituents. Like, for example, if you serve a population that have other health risks, then obviously you would want to go above and beyond. So it's really understanding not just the public health recommendations, but the expectations of those you serve. That would be the first one. The second one is really understanding long-term, what are the avenues this can go and how do we think about it? So, you know, I don't know about your organization, but a lot of organizations have been managing day to day. Some are getting now week to week. Very few are thinking month to month, but thinking longer term and not predicting, but mapping out what are the potential ways this could go, how is it going to impact us, and what do we do in those situations, as opposed to having to make those decisions in real time. So, you know, one of the things that you could do is hold a strategy session where we call it running a war game scenario, where you would run through, here's the 15 different things that could happen. How would we deal with that? You break up into small groups and you force your leadership team to think about those issues in advance, so they're not dealing with it in real time. I mean, if you're working for a not-for-profit, the big challenge obviously is going to be a decrease in donations. So with the market turning down, I don't know what your source of funds has been, but I would say even government is probably going to be stretched going forward in terms of grants. So how do you deal with that in the new normal, and what does that mean for your organization?
Thank you for that. Actually, it's interesting. In the one case that I'm looking at, finances are not the issue. We likely have about 18 months of room or runway. And given that the activities which are sort of client-facing, it's a choral association. I think the real challenge is how do we resume activities given COVID, right, for us, because you can't come together and sing, particularly not with children, and with the broader audience of stakeholders are you know, family members and seniors included in that envelope. It's really been, well, if we're not active, you know, the challenge is actually what are we doing, and how do we manage these things? So I mean, we've actually we're looking at how do we continue to provide value to the community and to our community of stakeholders without putting them at risk. So I think the war game scenario is actually quite a good one, because we definitely do need to rethink our model of how do we provide value to our stakeholders. Thank you.
Hi, and I see also Laura has a note in here, and she was talking about the diversity in the boardroom and the issues arising from the pandemic, and speaking to deep social inequality gap. She's wondering what your opinion is on CEOs going beyond the gender diversity in addressing these issues. I would start by saying that diversity as a whole has always been an issue in the boardroom, and has, you know, gender diversity came to the forefront, but at the same time, it's always been an issue. And so I think that maybe this is bringing it also forward a little bit more so. But what are your thoughts on that?
I would say diversity as a term has become a catch-all phrase that allows people to think that they're doing something to help marginalized groups. And in reality, nothing has happened for anyone. Gender diversity took a long time to actually get to the forefront. But I think if you ask any other visible minority in Canada, have they been well served by the diversity initiative? The answer is going to be no. I mean, even those companies who say we're a diverse company, hold that up against your management team and your boardroom, right? How many visible minorities do you see in there, right? Even how many women do you see in there? So it doesn't hold up when you actually look at companies who say that they're diverse. I mean, the Stockwell Day example, right? TELUS fired him, but the problem is that Stockwell Day is probably going to be replaced by another middle-aged white man. Until people like us call TELUS out on it, then it might not be the case. So more definitely needs to be done in that area. But the key with all of this is, making sure that you really have measurable targets in place on the one hand, and on the other hand, that when you're dealing with a concept that's as amorphous and abstract as systemic racism, that you're really drilling down on what does that mean for our organization. When somebody says systemic racism, what does that in practice mean for our organization, and what do we need to do about it? So for example, making sure that there's anti-bias training, these sorts of things in your companies.
Agreed. Are there any other questions for Ian? Well, Ian, I would like to say personally, thank you very much. That was extremely informative and brought a lot of things to the table that, even me sitting here haven't thought of. So I'm going to be listening back to it again so that I can make sure that I know all of them to raise with my board. And the list of questions that you provided was very good. Patricia noted in the group chat, I'm not sure how many people were paying attention to that this presentation will be available to the members that joined today, as well as it will be posted on the website for those members who couldn't attend. If you would like a copy of the presentation itself, we can always get that from Ian to pass along. I'll take this moment then to thank everyone for attending this session. The CGIBC hope to host more of these online sessions going forward and encourage you to provide feedback via the email you RSVP to, or you may do so directly to myself as the president of the BC branch, jodyharrisconsulting@gmail.com. And I hope that everybody has a great day. The BC division is going to be holding their AGM virtually in about 20 minutes for our first time as well. And so some of you have RSVP'd for that. And so we'll see you then. Thanks again, Ian. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Amy.
Thanks for having us.
Have a great day.